Hey, hi everyone, I'm Chris. I'm the Research Data Management Librarian from NUS Libraries. With me here, I have Prof Kan Min-Yen, who's the Vice Dean, Undergraduate Office, NUS School of Computing. Today, the talk is about why share data, conversation on a professor's data sharing journey and research data management. So a gentle reminder that this workshop will be recorded for archival and marketing purposes. This is what we're here to talk about today. We have this talk about the benefits of good data sharing and also RDM, research data management. We're hearing it firsthand from an NUS researcher, and this researcher would be Prof Min. We're spending about half an hour to talk about the benefits of good data sharing and his own data sharing journey. And then we have some time for the Q&A. If you have any questions, please input your questions into the chat box. Then after that, I'll follow through with a short 10 minutes roundup on the benefits of good data sharing practices. And then finally, we'll give you guys a few avenues on how to get started with RDM in NUS. Okay, let me introduce Min properly first. Prof Kan Min-Yen, Vice Dean, Undergraduate Office, NUS School of Computing. He is a senior member of the ACM and a member of the IEEE. Currently, he is an associate director, editor for the journal Information Retrieval, and is the editor for the ACL Anthology, the computational linguistics community's largest archive of published research. His research interests include digital libraries and applied natural language processing. So to give everyone some context as to why we've invited Min for this talk, we thought that having an actual RDM success story of an NUS researcher who actually carried out a lot of great data management strategies and saw real benefits from sharing his research data would make for a more compelling story to the NUS community on why data management and data sharing are necessary. So on the left, we have the original 2013 research paper from Min, creating a live public short message service corpus, the NUS SMS corpus, which was published in the Language Resources and Evaluation. This was also deposited into ScholarBank. And on the right, you see the underlying dataset that was generated, the NUS SMS corpus. The dataset contains over 80,000 SMSs, of which 55,000 are English and 31,000 are Chinese. So Min, tell us more about this research project.
Yeah, so back in 2013 and even before that, I think we started the project around 2010 or so. We realized that the language that we're using to communicate is rapidly changing. And of course, this is quite dated by now. We don't use the SMS that much to communicate with each other. We use other things like WhatsApp or Telegram a lot. But back then, people were actually writing messages on phones that are hard to type with. You would have to key in 3 times on the number 2 or something like that to get the letter C, because you had to press it 3 times to go from A to B to C. We wanted to study how people are composing SMS, what they write about, what input systems do they use. Okay, and then we had a series of students, starting with an FYP student, I think around even before 2010, that did this work to collect SMS. But then we decided, we wanted to make it public, and we had to ensure that that process was transparent and easily understood by contributors, that they were making their messages public, right? So that instituted a second version too, which is the result of the paper that you see here, and then the subsequent deposit into ScholarBank. Yeah, so that's the impetus for the project, and I can share more about that later on. Yeah.
Oh, we're also very curious because the sharing of this data set was done in 2015 when open sharing of data was not really widely practiced. So what motivated you actually to want to share this data set in the first place?
I think data sets are the enablement of a lot of different downstream research, and we see that especially in my field, natural language processing and AI. So the natural language processing field is the progenitor of things like ChatGPT and other things that concern a lot of us these days, right? But the whole premise is that in order to train an AI system, you need data. Okay, so in specific language data. So being able to create language data, put it into a corpus that's machine readable and treatable by Excel spreadsheets or other software that can manipulate the text is a key enabler for this type of research. So I think it really depends a lot on the practices that people have within their field. So in a lot of corpus linguistics, people actually do want to go to the field, record either digital recordings or voice recordings, or in our case, typed input, and archive that. And in many ways, we want to increase the impact of our work by making sure other people can use that data, right? If we keep it only within our own groups, we can produce new research, but then no one gets a chance to validate whether the conclusions that we have are right? So it's in fact in the computational linguistics field quite ordinary, even at that time, to start to share data. Yeah.
Okay, so your project collected SMSs on using many different methods, but we wanted to highlight this to our audience because it was very interesting, and it basically is a nifty technological solution. Your team actually created an SMS export app for Android phones, and there were automatic anonymization capabilities and also phone number encryption. Could you walk us through what you were trying to achieve here with this?
Absolutely. So if you look at the top left of the screen, right, that's where we started from. We were trying to get some of our students, we had actually some Scientia high school students attached to the project, as well as our own FYP students. We wanted them to go out into the field to collect SMS. It's not so easy, right? I mean, if you have an SMS on a phone, you're not going to type it again to give it to a researcher, right? So the best thing to do is to be able to say, can I bulk download SMSs from somebody's phone? And at that time, what we were thinking is, well, we could design an app for that, right? So we had some research engineers, they were undergraduate students, come up with an export app from the phone's SMS. And we couldn't do this on Windows phones at that time or iPhones. We could only do it on Android. So we targeted Android users that our students could talk to students who had Android phones, say, would you be willing to contribute some SMSs for research, right? And so what they would do is select the SMSs that they wanted to export. They don't have to set all, right? It's just self-reported things that they don't mind sharing. And remember, at that time, SMS was really used for personal communication. You didn't have all of the automated SMS systems that we have these days. So these are genuine SMSs, like people saying, okay, where do you want to eat for lunch? Or that exam was too difficult, or I'm really depressed. A lot of things that have moved off of the SMS platform now, right? So all of this was something we wanted to capture. Now, if you look at the top middle box, a big concern is, of course, if I'm giving my data, can you figure out who I am and then link back to me contributing that data? So it was a big part of the project to try to anonymize what input was given to our project. So we had to search for phone numbers in the text using text matching. So if you say, for example, 8 digits, probably it's a phone number. So we'll just scramble that to a unique letter number combination so that you can track that, this particular phone number was used several times, but we don't know what the phone number is. Okay, so that we could get reliable statistics about the text in those messages, right? So that went for both the phone numbers that we're sending or receiving, as well as sensitive information that was in the SMS themselves, okay? So that meant some of our students actually had to go through and sanitize, strike out information in addition to what the contributors themselves would select, right? Like if I have a romantic date, probably I don't want to send that SMS and have it archived, right? So the important part about this is it exists as an app on your phone, right? So what it would do, so it generate a draft, that's the middle box there, for people using Android that had access to Gmail, which is pretty much everyone, right? Because Android is from Google, Gmail is from Google, right? And then that draft would allow contributor to just go through all of the message and say, okay, I think these are okay to send. This one I don't want, I can delete it. And then when they are ready, they can just send it, right? And it will come to our contributing system, and we would have that information and thank them for their contribution to the corpus. Okay, so we actually sent, I think, 3 or 4 NUS students as well as NUS high school students out into the wild, asked them to network with people and actually solicit contributions through other crowdsourcing and crowd working platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk for them to contribute. So for example, part of the messages that you saw on the previous screen are Chinese Mandarin messages. They were solicited from researchers who had networks even in mainland China as well. Yeah.
So you can see actually the process was both systematic and also a lot of manual data management involved. So I wanted to show the audience this as well. Remember we were talking about how there was this data anonymization features in the SMS export app. So this is what they actually did. They actually wrote replacement codes to anonymize all these personal identifiers and numbers. So Min, could you explain more about what this is supposed to do?
Yeah, so if you think about it, when you send SMS or nowadays WhatsApp or Telegram, right, you're sending a lot of personal information. And we want to know about the types of information that's being sent, but not in the sense to de-anonymize who you're talking to or what topic you want, right? So things like, for example, we want to know how many times people are talking about dates or times, because we want to know what are they talking about when. Like it's actually, we know this for a fact, during evening hours, SMS traffic picks up a lot and people are usually talking about where they're going to eat or what they're going to do that evening. And during the daytime, during office hours, people generally talk about work-related stuff and traffic slow. And all of that can only be figured out in mass when you have a large set of SMS messages and you analyze them to look for things like that. Like how many people were talking about websites. So we would take a URL, you know, and then replace it with that code there, an angle bracket. So we wouldn't know which site you were talking about unless you said it in words. You know, I'm using a search engine, and then you paste the search engine's name, then we would know you're talking about Google or Bing. Okay, but all that information was helpful in tracking the behaviors of what people were discussing, right? So again, we want to know these types of things at large because demographic information about how people behave as a mass really matters. You can think about healthcare analytics. You can think about, you know, even here in the library, like what are people borrowing? Why are they borrowing it? What for what purposes? You don't want to know the exact research topic, you know, but you'd like to know like which areas of service are important, right? So that's why we did all of these things.
Yeah, clearly a lot of thought has gone into how to have the data for analysis and yet have it not be identifiable to individuals. That's great. Okay, we also wanted to talk about this because we find it very interesting that upfront, your team made the interesting data management practice of making all the contributors fill out an online demographic survey about their background, about the texting habits, about their phone type. So what made you and your team think of collecting so much metadata as possible about these messages and their senders right from the start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's because of the research hypothesis that we had. We were actually looking at how to optimize phone input. Okay, again, remember the days when you had like a smartphone and smartphone was pretty dumb by comparison today, right? But you actually had to press multiple buttons to get out a single letter. And there was no autocomplete or predictive text, perhaps, you know, making problems less problematic, right? But you know, to capture ways of how people input text is an avenue to improving it. So you see a lot of predictive elements now when you use an Android phone or an Apple phone, right? It'll just start to fill in words for you. And this is the precursor to that, right? To collect how people are typing, what their texting habits are, what type of phone, because that tells us what type of input system they were using. That made a big difference, right? For example, if you're a Mandarin Chinese user, you know that predictive character input, you know, deciding which Chinese character you're typing is much more important than in English, right? If you're sending English SMS, usually you get annoyed when the auto predicts the wrong word, right? Yeah, I mean, we see even joke sites on the web say, yeah, autocomplete fails, right? So they're very funny. Yeah, but all of these are basically the avenue towards that research, right? So when we were thinking about our particular research questions, we were really thinking about, okay, if we're going to analyze these, what pieces of demographic information do we need to know? So we were collecting, for example, the second and the third bullet, mostly for that type of research. But it turns out a lot of this metadata is useful for other things, right? Because when we look at age or gender, native speaker or not, they can be used to analyze elements of language not related to optimizing text input, which was what our original research question was.
Okay, so we talked about how you have managed the data in the project. So when we came time for you to deposit the data in Scholar Bank itself, did you face any specific challenges or barriers in preparing the data set for deposit, including filling out the metadata for deposit in Scholar Bank?
I think it's not so difficult. The problem is, I think when we are not very experienced with data sharing, there's a little bit of an adoption curve that you have to surmount, right? So you have to prepare the metadata, and once your research group or your team gets sort of accustomed to it, just sort of like filling out institutional review forms, right? IRBs, okay, which is absolutely necessary for a lot of research. For I think junior scholars and teams who haven't done it before, they think of it as a barrier to research, right? But when you share data and you do this and you tag your data well, then it becomes much more discoverable for others, right? And that discovery is key if you want to promote impact. Like I tell my team all the time, publishing is only maybe 1/2 of what you have to do, right? I mean, of course, it's hard to get your your work published. There's the publish or perish paradigm, but it's also that you want to create impact, and that means getting it out there so that other people can use it, right? If you work on research, but it comes in a form where it's very hard to take up or use, then people are just going to find another alternative. Right. So that happens a lot in the IT industry, right? You might have the greatest app for doing some particular thing, but if it's not easily usable, people will gravitate to something that works less well, but has a nicer user interface. So I encourage all of you, when you're thinking about sharing your data, you really have to think about who is going to use it, okay? And try to tag it as if you weren't doing it yourself, right? Like I can imagine what type of stakeholders might be interested in using an SMS corpus, and then try to visualize what types of tags or metadata would I be searching for, right? And then insert them into any system like Scholar Bank, so that when a search engine like Google or another search engine is able to find that information, it can be reported. Yeah.
I think that's such a great explanation. And also, I think for most of you researchers out there, when you've written the research article, actually you already have a lot of those keywords present already. And when you do your IRBs, you're essentially repeating the same metadata and the form filling again for your deposit into Scholar Bank eventually. Okay, so since the deposit in Scholar Bank, the deposit of the dataset in Scholar Bank, we found that actually there's immense global interest in it. And we already have over 1,800 downloads of the dataset as at October 2023. You can see from geographic region that there is research interest not only in Asia and Singapore, but even in Europe and also North America. What do you make of the interest of this dataset?
I think, a lot of people are interested in how people communicate online, and SMS is just one way of triangulating how that works, because there's so many different ways that we communicate. There are people who leave short voice memos. There are people who type emails, like I'm prevalently in that community. But there are plenty of ways that we communicate, right? So having a holistic picture is really important if you're really trying to understand communication, right? So it's not locally it's not just relevant locally, right? This type of information is really a global thing, right? And SMS is particularly hard to get to because if you think of it, most people don't want to share their SMSs for good reason. They're personal, right? And so having a system that allows you to anonymize it is a crucial aspect of that. Um, there are actually many providers who have access to SMS. You can think of telcos like StarHub or Singtel. They have a record of all of your SMSs that can be subpoenaed by the government or other things, but nobody's using that data for research, right? Those are all things that only information providers are securing away for audit purposes, but they're not using it to understand languages, right? And furthermore, that information is really, really important because it's at a global aspect, right? So if we want to understand language, we really need to capture that, right? And I think in part, a lot of people in computational linguistics are really, really curious about the pidgin that is Singaporean language, right? So it's something that's drawing from all sorts of ethnic and cultural identities. And so when we think of a pidgin or a Creole, more evolved form of a pidgin, right, where we have adapted and used languages interchangeably, that's something that my group studies a lot is code switching, and I think a lot of people worldwide are very interested in that because the world is becoming much more multicultural, right? We see a lot of children who are of mixed heritage and they speak, maybe German as well as Mandarin Chinese at home, and they freely interchange between these languages. Yeah.
In RDM, we often say that one of the benefits of data sharing is that other researchers are able to reuse the data and generate new research from it. We found these two just from a data citation of your Scholar Bank dataset deposit. So one of them is a research journal, Singlish, Where Got Rules 1, where the NTU researchers claim to have created the first computational grammar of Singlish based on Singlish texts that were obtained from the SMS corpus from NUS. They also noted that as Singlish is not a formal language, large resources of textual data is not as easy to obtain. So clearly that was a valuable resource to them. We also found the use of this dataset in a data science blog where actually the author used the SMS corpus from NUS to fine-tune a Singlish chatbot. The article was called Beginner's Guide to Building a Singlish AI Chatbot. So are you aware, Min, of where your data is being reused and in what research areas it's being used?
To a certain extent, yes, but definitely, some of these cases, when Chris brought them up to me, they're new to me. I had no idea it was being used that widely. I think it's good. You build a product or a data set or research, and it has a life of its own. And we, as our researchers, we have a duty to make sure that research is heard, right? So we want to deposit the data, make it widely available wherever it's possible. So I also want to point out that depositing data in NUS libraries or other institutional repositories is not the only way of doing it. You can do multiple at once. In fact, GitHub, which is a very famous code sharing and data set sharing website that computer scientists use, also generates a lot of traffic. So actually, our data set is also present up on the on GitHub, which it's also been used a lot. Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Oh, we'll be talking more about GitHub later. So along with the reuse, we also noticed that, of course, there are increased citations for the journal article itself. So according to Google Scholar, your original research article, the Creating a Live Public Short Message Service corpus, has been cited an additional 124 times since 2016 after the related dataset was released for open sharing in 2015. Do you think that the article's high citation numbers since have any relation to do with your dataset being openly shared on both Scholar Bank and on GitHub?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely in my field, in computational linguistics, if you have a data set, you usually do want to share it out because that is one of the ways that we create impact. Like we said before, it's hard to know exactly where it gets used. So when you have things like Google Scholar that can trace the provenance of a citation, it's helpful because then you can scan the list of where it's been used, at least according to automated algorithms like Google Scholar. Yeah, so it's very interesting. Like, for example, on the screen, I didn't know that it's being used for tasks on Twitter, right? Because if you think about Twitter messages, they're all quite like SMS. So, these are close cousins of forms of communications to each other. And SMS at that time didn't really allow emojis, but emojis are a more recent invention around 2008 or so. So they didn't quite make it into SMS-1 when we were taking the first versions of our corpus. Yeah.
Finally, we wanted to talk to you about data sharing for maximum discoverability.
Mhm.
We were very surprised because we learned only after checking to you that other than Scholar Bank, you had also placed this data set in GitHub. And when we asked you for other tips that you can share for data sharing to our NUS community, you actually suggested a few other places to share your data. Could you talk more about why you have suggested these repositories as well for sharing?
Well, I have to say I'm a little biased because I'm in natural language processing and computer science, and a lot of our research interoperates because of open source and open data sharing. So a lot of these platforms are ones that are specific, like GitHub, which is the second bullet, is where we deposited our corpus as well, and there's some traction there. Hugging Face Hub is probably the most specific that has to do with large language models like ChatGPT. Zenodo is probably the one that's most general and applicable to a lot of STEM research. So a lot of data sets from astronomy, physics, math, and urban studies are also placed on that. So those are data sets that are managed by CERN, which is the high energy physics lab in Switzerland. So those data sets can be very large. It can be astronomy data sets with petabytes of data even. But the important thing is that you have to figure out where your community might share data, right? You can see what are the best practices, and if there's no best practice, you might try to look for adjacent fields that are doing research data sharing, and then start from those practices to put out research on your own. If you're worried about taking proprietary resources that your group owns and has a competitive advantage for publication, you can try with resources that are less important, right? For example, output that may come from FYP students, which is where this project originated from, or UROP students. And you can say, well, I'm going to do an experiment, just like any good scholar would, right? I'm going to put some of my data online, and I'm going to keep most of my data because my particular field doesn't practice a lot of data sharing. I'm going to keep that undiscovered, right? Or just within my lab, right? And then you can track how things go. There have been quite a number of publications showing that when we share our publications or our data openly, especially if the right types of protections have been put in place to preserve the rights of the data owners, that can transform and enable a lot of downstream research, especially for use cases that you might have not originally thought about, right? So I would recommend Zenodo as probably the most general, but there are lots of different platforms. For example, I think in medicine, especially in biology, PubMed Central is mandated by a lot of funding agencies in the US for them to deposit at least the abstract and the title and the metadata in PubMed Central for discovery. But then you can consider other things such as making your data available, right? And in addition to your publication or as a separate thing from your publication. Yeah.
So last question for me before we open this to our audience. What is the one advice you would share with researchers out there if they haven't started sharing their data actively before? Where should one begin if they have not shared their data before?
That's a great question. I think we have to look inside ourselves to say, where is the data or work that we're doing that could be most applicable for other researchers to latch onto. It doesn't necessarily have to be within your field, although that's certainly the most important, right? Because especially as researchers, we want to be promoted eventually, to get tenure and things of the sort. And that means that citations and use within our own field are the most important. But I think when you get to be a more senior researcher, especially the university cares a lot about impact, right? So what exactly is impact? It means that your research is widely understood and used by a plethora of fields, right? And that means being able to explain your discoveries or your data in this case to multiple stakeholders, right? And as Chris was talking about before, making sure that the metadata that you encode is general enough to capture the types of interest that you think other people will come to, right? So that's, I think, the key part is just start with something that's low risk, find a data repository that makes sense. If us as PIs aren't so sure, we can ask our students, because our students are the ones looking for prior work, right? So they're using the internet and other vehicles within a particular field to discover what's out there. So they can recommend platforms that might be good for you to try.
With that, let's go to the chat to see if there are any questions for Min. Okay, there's one question for Min. Is it necessary to obtain the contributor's consent to share data publicly?
Oh, absolutely. You definitely need to get consent. So this is why you need to go through IRB typically. So for this study that we did for SMS, we had to go through IRB. So IRB is the Institutional Review Board. It is the case where we would have a separate set of professors look through the protocols for doing the research, especially making sure that the subjects are protected in their data rights, that they're giving consent for that information. So anytime we want to publish work, we have to get consent from our subjects, right? There are lots of surveys that we do within NUS. They don't necessarily ask for consent. That is because those surveys are for operational purposes, like to decide what we want to do. But as soon as we want to publish research, then there must be the full disclosure that what you're contributing is going to be shared, okay? And then it also means Institutional Review Board will check that there are the right options in place. For example, if a contributor contributed to your data set and then decided later they don't want that data shared, then you are mandated by IRB to take that data out, right? There has to be full protection of the research, the research participant.
Okay, another question. How do you train your students, undergraduate, postgrad, to have the right mindset for research data management? Are there specific workflows that you put in place for your research group?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that is something that you need to inculcate wherever you can. For example, when you ask your students to present work, you might ask them, how did you find out this data set? Where did you find this information out? And you can, do a thought experiment with them too. You can say, okay, if you discovered it and you found it on this website or this data repository, how do you think our group could do the same? Like what types of practice that we could do to enable that, right? So a lot of this goes back down to the idea of an institutional repository where you can deposit your own research on your homepage, or if you don't have one, then you can go to NUS libraries and say, can you find a home for this data? Right. And I think going forward, there are lots of granting bodies now that are aware that data and studies need to be replicable, right? Because we've seen a lot of cases in science, because it's going so far so fast with sharing, is that if you share the papers, but you don't share the underlying data, we can't replicate those
Yes.
studies, right? So that really necessitates platforms for keeping all of that data such that a third party can go replicate those again. In fact, this is a problem in computer science law. Actually, we have particular workshops whose whole purpose is to see whether the results from 2-3 years ago actually holds, right? Because things change, and maybe things get broken. Yeah. So I think that's a wonderful question. It requires a bit of introspection for people and groups that are not doing data sharing. It requires a little bit forward thinking and to say, is it possible that by sharing data, my group is going to create more impact overall, even though it may lose out 1 or 2 publications, right? Because the way we create impact is not to create work, it's to create work that's being used by others. Yeah.
Okay. Another question. Thanks so much for the insightful sharing, Prof Min. Do you have any advice on best practices regarding data sharing when working in cross-university collaborations and research? And other than replacing personal identifiers, are there any other ways to ensure data privacy and anonymization?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. So there's 2 questions in here. So let me take apart the second question about data privacy and anonymization. So I think a lot of that we have to do programmatically to check on our own. So some of the filters that Chris showed in the slides are about that. We had a programmer create those filters, but also is to give the locus of control back to our contributors, right? Because we want our contributors to say, yes, I enable this, okay? And for us to be good citizens, we want to opt in, right? That you have to specifically say, I want this data shared, right? Because there are a lot of platforms out there. In fact, you use them every day. When you buy a new app or use a new system, it has all that tiny text and you have
Email
click
content.
here. I agree,
And I
right?
agree.
Yeah, I mean, we want the services, but we don't know exactly what we're handing over a lot of times, okay? As researchers, we don't want to be so sneaky, right? So that means that we want to be very explicit, and IRB will help you with that in saying that is a practice that you're enabling and that you understand that the research is going to be committed. Okay, so there's a second question there, which was about cross-university collaboration. And I think here it's a little bit tricky because it depends on who you're collaborating with. You have to look at the policies from different researchers. So for example, I'll take 2 different cases, one of the US, whose privacy and restrictions are comparable or superior in some ways to Singapore, and of China, which is, I think right now still dealing with ramping up the considerations for user protections and privacy. Right. So I would say we would try to go with whichever institution we feel has the higher protections for human subjects, right? So if you're collaborating with a US institution, many times because IRB is a very intensive process, it requires sometimes a month or 2, you may decide only to collect data at one site, either on the Singapore site or on the US site, right? Just to make it easier for work. Sometimes you want to do both, and that's fine. It's just that it takes longer for doing that. Uh, and if you're doing on just one site, then you have to make sure that the data is representative of what you want. Like, for example, if we were just collecting SMS in the US, it wouldn't help us understand Singlish, right? So that's very important that you collect the data at the right site. Okay, when you're collaborating, for example, with China or India or other places that may not have a very strong human rights and contributor protection, I think it behooves us as institutions in Singapore to make sure that we follow the best practices here, right? Because we don't want to be caught in trouble and say, oh, well, we collected this data in China, so we don't have to follow whatever regulations are in Singapore, right? So that wouldn't be appropriate unless, again, the data is specific that we want to capture things in China, okay, or in India, and therefore we're following their best practices, okay? You can always upgrade, like Chris mentioned, some of the policies that we had here may have been a little bit early adopters, and that's not a problem, right? I mean, you can always upgrade yourself and upgrade the way that you're doing things. In in anticipation of things to come, right? So that's what we did in this project, and it's good that we have the chance to reflect upon that here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Min. There's another question. Other than IRB, do we need other research agreements, DTA, RCA, to share the data publicly? And are our cross-country collaborators required to apply for their own IRB using our data sets?
Okay. Thanks, Anshi, for the question. So I think it depends on the particular project, and it depends on the particular discipline. So you might ask your departments or your faculty's research office to see whether research agreements are needed. Usually, if you want to share the data publicly, we don't know who is going to use that data unless it's still kept under closed doors and you're sharing only to a target audience, right? So that can happen a lot. You can put up a website saying this data set is available, but if you want it, you must sign a research agreement with us. And then only after we validated that you are actually a researcher of merit, then we can share it with you. Because sometimes the data is something you don't want to go in the open. For example, you have a data set that could be commercially important, but you don't want it to go without license to a commercial company, but you're okay to let it out to academics. Then you would have to have a different type of data agreement or data license for that, right? So cross-country collaborators, usually if they're using your data set and it's already out in the open, then they don't need IRB because it's publicly visible. If it is a data set that you've encumbered with a license, like I said earlier, you might have a website advertising your data set, but the data set is only obtained through email or through a link that you would provide if somebody requests it and you validate them, then maybe they do have to apply IRB. They have to say that, this data was collected by Singaporean researchers. They're following their best practices. And for the most part, we feel that the way that they've collected it meets the standards that are good for the country where my collaborator is.
There's also another question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it necessary to, oh, sorry, we've already answered that. So I think we've gone through all the questions.
There's one there about research fraud from Patsy.
I think RDM might also aid with guarding against research fraud, but I can't quite see the connection at this point. Does Min have any insights to share on this aspect?
Yeah, research fraud, I think, is a really big problem these days. Like I said, and thanks, Patsy, for this question, is that we're facing a replicatability crisis in a lot of fields, right? We've seen some very high-level retractions of key papers that promise a lot of impact, right? From semiconductors to superconductors to cancer research, etc. So these days, because things travel very fast, right? You can have overnight explosions of things on Twitter or X or whatever you'd like to call it, or on Facebook. Trends can develop very quickly, and unscrupulous researchers might want to take advantage of that. So by putting your data public, it allows anyone to scrutinize your work, right? You can say, well, all of my cards are on the table. I've given you all the data. Furthermore, in order to replicate our research, we're giving you the Excel spreadsheet or the program that allows you to come and draw the same charts, the same diagrams that we have in our research article. Okay, and so actually there's a number of publishers looking at this to say, for example, of what they call an executable paper, right? Which means that in addition to the prose and the charts, okay, you provide a program or a notebook that can be run on a computer that will actually generate the same conclusions that you have from the primary data that you share. So alongside the paper, which is a digesting of the raw data, you also offer all of the recipes, if you will, to digest the raw data and come up with your results. So I think that's very important because then you can actually replicate the research and we don't have to pretend that it's really true, right? Because sometimes when we read an article, we want to be skeptical. We want to have enough evidence that what the scholar team is saying is actually verifiably true, right? But we can't for the most part. If you say in your paper, we have statistically significant results, we have to sort of judge whether the language is good and represents that. And we also often judge the the profile of the scholar, right? If they're from a reputable institution, you'd think people from this university probably wouldn't lie, right? And having the data out there in the open also facilitates that. It's another quality marker to say, not only is this from NUS, but they've also put the data out there, and they've also presented information about being able to replicate the research, okay? Those are all quality markers in addition to our normal ones, like being in a top tier journal, being highly cited scholar. Yeah.
Okay, so we have time for one final question. Uh, have researchers outside of the field of computing approached you with offers to collaborate, having learned about your work through your data sets?
Actually, yes, there have been some. Many of them are students doing research projects for their thesis. So they'll sometimes come and ask, oh, I was uh, interested in obtaining your data set, because sometimes at the beginning, especially before we openly shared it, they read about it, but they weren't able to get the data set. This is in part why we decided to do this second tier. So this is the version 2 of the corpus that was shared. Um, Additionally, I think it's important, especially in your articles, to try to say we're very interested in hearing about use cases. So this corpus actually has a website, and our website does specifically say, we encourage people to reach out to us if you're using it. So don't only can they cite it, but we'd like to hear from them. So we do hear occasionally from people say, oh, I use this corpus to contrast how SMS in Singapore is written compared to, Kenyan SMS or something like that, from other countries, because they're doing a comparative study. It could be just a student, not a high profile researcher, but I mean, that's what we want, right? We want to enable research at all levels and to acknowledge those people who bother to contribute back, maybe not in a citation, which is fine, but actually, in words, right? In a heartfelt email that says, oh, your data set was useful to me. Thanks for compiling it.
Oh, I think I can speak for everyone that there's a lot of hardcore sharing about RDM from Min that we've heard here. If I may summarize some key takeaways from what Min has shared, it's that good data planning right from the start allows for metadata capturing and analysis. Good data planning also allows for as much data to be shared as possible because there's built-in consent management, and there's also upfront anonymization of personal identifiers. Another takeaway would be share your data where your target audience will find it, because you never know when your target audience is. It may be someone outside of your discipline, actually.
Yes.
And finally, very obvious, open sharing of your data leads to increase in visibility, citations, and new research being generated. So that is very obvious. So which leads me nicely to the final section on the benefits of sharing data and RDM. So this will actually tie in Min's example, as well as some things that he actually mentioned already in terms of reproducibility and compelling drivers to do good data sharing. So why is there a need to do RDM? RDM is basically how you look after your data throughout your research project from start to end. It ensures that the research data are managed and shared according to legal, statutory, ethical, and funding body requirements. So this RDM actually exists in an open research and open science ecosystem, whereby there are lots of efforts in the Europe and in the US to make the output of publicly funded research more widely accessible to the research community, the public and private sectors, and the society at large. And they always recommend that when you share this data, you try to apply the FAIR guiding principles when sharing. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Here you see a lot of factors that were actually mentioned by Min just now. So when you try to make your data findable, you're attaching descriptive metadata to a data set, and you index it with a persistent identifier, something like a DOI. And that makes it possible for other researchers to find the data and code. Then you make your data accessible. By using an open access repository that is publicly available, like Scholar Bank, it makes it possible for other researchers to access that data and code. Finally, thirdly, you have interoperable. If you use file and data formats that are following standards and are persistent or open source, it makes it more likely that other researchers will be able to open and use the files. Finally, we have reusable. If you're able to provide adequate description of the provenance, for example, who created it under what conditions, if you have good descriptions of the files, the contents, the variables, the values, even annotation for the statistical code, it will make it possible for other researchers to understand and reuse the data and code, the reproducibility factor. So these are more reasons for why you should do open data sharing. Some of it is benefits to the society and to the researcher. Some of it are drivers. So for the benefits, obviously, you avoid research duplication when you can share data and people can find it easily. And with this open research eco-environment, it helps to improve scientific integrity in the sense that all your open research methods are scrutinized, and therefore it leads to better research and reproducibility. In turn, all these will lead to more collaborations and increased citations of your journal article and your data set. In fact, even in 2007, we have a PLOS study that said that there's actually a 69% increase in citations for journal articles that have publicly available data attached to it. And of course, we have the drivers as well to encourage open data sharing. A lot of funders are actually moving to this state whereby there's actually a mandate for them to share data for people who take their grants to share data. This is especially true in Europe and in the US. Many journals already require you to actually deposit your data when you do your submission for your article already. And there's also a government agenda increasingly, even in Singapore itself. And of course, there's also public expectations that research is actually a public good. So they would like to see that shared as well, more openly. And more compelling reasons why you should share data in Singapore. The National Medical Research Council has just announced that for any funding for grants above Sing dollars 250,000 from 1st January next year, they require the submission of a data sharing plan as part of the grant application. So this is mandated now for funding above 250K. And when you finally finish your project, you're supposed to give an update on the data sharing plan and also deposit the anonymized final research data on the NMRC's data repository itself. So with all that sharing, right, we get to how you can actually get started with research data management. So we have only one slide for you for this, for you guys to start looking at how you can do data sharing and better research data management. For a start, there is a second workshop for RDM on best practices in the context of NUS next month on the 15th of November at Wednesday. Please look out for the registration for that. Then here at NUS Libraries, we also have a RDM library guide, which is very comprehensive for all areas of data management from start to the end of the project. So please take a look at that for some pointers on how you can do certain things to manage your data better as well. And then here at NUS, we also have the Academic and Research Compliance and Integrity Office. So the ARCIO website also has a research data management webpage that is also very useful for researchers as well for NUS. I've also included the email address here. And finally, of course, here at NUS Libraries, we have the scholarly communications team, of which I am part of it. We also have a contact email that you can write to for RDM matters and also research impact matters as well. And finally, last but not least, we have Scholar Bank at NUS, which is the institutional repository of NUS. So please consider using that for depositing your research articles and also for your research data sets as well. With that, I've come to the end of our session. Let me just check the chat to see if there's any questions. Okay, I don't see any questions that are new, but if you have any questions for us, please, I've included the contact email for the Scholarly Comms team. Please drop us an email. And we'd like to close and thank Min for his generous sharing with our NUS community. Really, I think we benefited so much for all that in-depth sharing, how to do data sharing, how to do all these data management matters, and use you as an example for other people to emulate, okay? We would also like to thank you for attending this session and hope you've been inspired to do better RDM as well. So your feedback matters. Please, if you could scan this link, if you could, please give us some thoughts on and feedback about this session, if you will. And also to email us if you have any questions. Okay, thank you very much, folks.